The dust rose thick that morning over the small frontier town of Dry Creek, curling up from wagon wheels and boot heels as though the earth itself was sighing. It was late spring of 1879, and the sun had already turned the main street into a shimmering ribbon of gold. The air smelled of hay, horse sweat, and something else. Tension. Folks had gathered outside the sheriff's office whispering, waiting for the sound of the auction bell. In towns like Dry Creek, excitement didn't come often. A gunfight, a horse race, a traveling preacher, or a public sale. Those were the moments that broke the monotony. But today's crowd wasn't smiling. Even the breeze that stirred the flags seemed reluctant to pass through. On the wooden platform built in front of the sheriff's porch stood a thin figure, barefoot, wrapped in a torn blanket that had lost its color to the sun. Her hair was long, tangled with dust, her face hollow from hunger. The townsfolk called her the Apache woman. Some said she was the last of her people taken alive after a skirmish near the San Pedro Hills. Others whispered darker things, that she'd been captured weeks ago, dragged through the desert half dead and brought here for trade. No one knew for sure. What they did know was that today she was being sold like a horse or a mule. The sheriff's voice rang out, steady but uncomfortable. "We'll start the bidding at $10. The silence that followed was louder than thunder. Men shifted their hats, cleared their throats, avoided looking at her. Women clutched their children's hands a little tighter. No one spoke. The woman stood still, eyes dark and unflinching, her pride hidden beneath the filth and the hunger. The town had seen many broken souls, but something about her silence felt heavier, almost defiant. From the edge of the crowd, a tall cowboy leaned against a post, watching. His hat was pulled low over his eyes, his coat worn from years of riding cattle trails across the desert. He'd come into town only to buy supplies, flour, beans, new reins for his horse. But when he heard talk of an auction, curiosity had drawn him closer. He'd seen men and women bought and sold before, though it never sat right with him. Still, the West was rough country, and sometimes survival twisted a man's sense of right and wrong. $10, the sheriff repeated, glancing nervously around. $10, anyone? A voice near the saloon snorted. "Ain't worth feedin'. She'll die before the week's out." A few men chuckled, spitting tobacco into the dust. But the cowboy didn't move. He was studying her, not like the others, but with a kind of quiet respect. There was something in the way she held herself, something that hadn't been beaten out of her yet. $5, another man called mockingly. "I'll take her to clean my stables." The sheriff's jaw tightened. $5, do I hear 6? She didn't flinch. Her eyes, though shadowed, flickered toward the crowd, and for a moment they locked with the cowboy's. It wasn't a plea. It was a spark. Something in him stirred. Maybe pity, maybe guilt, maybe something deeper, something he couldn't name. $10, the cowboy said quietly. The laughter stopped. Heads turned. The sheriff blinked. $10, sir? He nodded, stepping forward through the crowd, boots striking hard against the dry boards. The sun hit his face as he reached the platform, and for the first time the woman's expression changed. Not much, just a tiny lift of her chin, a breath that almost sounded like disbelief. "No one else?" the sheriff asked. The others muttered, but no one raised a bid. "Sold," the sheriff said finally, to the cowboy. The bell clanged once, sharp and final. The crowd began to disperse, though whispers followed the man as he reached into his coat for payment. Some muttered that he'd lost his mind. Others joked he must have had some strange purpose for her. He ignored them all. The woman didn't move when he untied the thin rope that bound her wrists. She only watched him with guarded eyes, still and silent. He handed her a piece of dried jerky from his pocket, motioning for her to eat. She hesitated, then took it, hands trembling slightly. Hunger overcame pride, and she bit into it, chewing slowly. He didn't speak, and she didn't thank him. In the language of that barren land, that was enough. They walked toward the stables at the edge of town. Each step she took left faint prints in the dust, fragile but steady. The cowboy's horse, a sturdy chestnut gelding, snorted as they approached. He untied it, adjusted the saddle, and motioned for her to climb up. She shook her head, almost frightened. "You can ride," he said softly, "or you can walk. But I ain't leaving you here." The words were plain, but the tone left no room for doubt. She looked up at him, eyes narrowing slightly, then reached for the saddle horn. He helped her up gently, as though afraid she might break. When she was settled, he swung into the saddle behind her, and they started west, leaving Dry Creek behind. The road stretched long and lonely through the red hills. Buzzards circled high above. In the distance, the horizon burned gold and orange under the sinking sun. Neither spoke for miles. The rhythm of the horse's hooves was the only sound, steady and calm. As the night began to fall, they reached a small stream that cut through a grove of cottonwoods. He dismounted, helped her down, and lit a small fire. She sat near it, rubbing her hands together, staring into the flames. The cowboy took off his hat, ran a hand through his hair, and finally spoke. "You got a name?" She didn't answer. He nodded slowly, accepting the silence. "All right," he said quietly. "Name can wait." The fire cracked, sending sparks into the dark. For the first time, she looked at him, not as an enemy or savior, but as something uncertain. He didn't try to meet her gaze this time. He simply offered her a tin cup of water and a piece of bread. She took them, hesitant but grateful. In that fragile quiet, something unspoken hung between them. She had lost everything, her people, her freedom, her dignity. He had no idea what he'd just bought or why. Maybe it wasn't mercy that drove him, but the simple refusal to see another soul left to rot in the dust. Still, deep inside, a question began to form. What would he do with her now? The wind rose, rustling the trees, carrying distant echoes of coyotes. The woman glanced toward the hills, eyes sharp, alert. Somewhere beyond those ridges lay the remains of her old life. Maybe her tribe, maybe only ghosts. The cowboy followed her gaze, and though he didn't understand her world, he understood loss. He'd buried his share of dreams beneath that same moon. He tossed another branch into the fire. "Tomorrow," he said quietly, "we'll reach my ranch. You'll be safe there." She turned to him, her voice soft but hoarse from disuse. "Safe?" The single word hung heavy between them, carrying both doubt and sorrow. He met her eyes finally. "I'll see to it." She studied him for a long moment before looking back at the flames. The shadows danced across her face, revealing the faint trace of a scar beneath the dirt. He wondered who she'd been before the chains, before the auction block. Someone's daughter, someone's sister, maybe even a mother. The thought gnawed at him as the night deepened. Somewhere far away, a wolf howled. The sound carried across the valley, long and lonely. The cowboy glanced toward the darkness, his hand brushing the handle of his revolver out of habit. The woman lifted her head. "They will come," she whispered. He turned toward her. "Who?" Her eyes glinted in the firelight, fierce for the first time. "The ones who sold me." The cowboy froze, realizing for the first time that his act of mercy might have bought him more than he'd bargained for. The silence stretched, broken only by the crackle of fire and the beat of his own uneasy heart. The night grew colder, and somewhere in the dark, unseen eyes watched from the ridge above. The cowboy didn't sleep much that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard the faint shuffle of leaves or the crack of a twig beyond the firelight. He wasn't sure if it was the wind or something worse. The woman's words echoed in his head. "They will come." She had said it like a promise, not a warning. He kept his hand close to his revolver, his eyes scanning the shadows until dawn painted the hills in pale gold. When the sun finally rose, he found her already awake, kneeling by the stream, washing the dirt from her hands and face. The cold water shimmered around her fingers, carrying away the dust of Dry Creek. Without the blanket and grime, he could see more clearly the marks of hardship, the bruises, the thinness, the quiet exhaustion that came from being hunted and starved. Yet, even in her weariness, there was something strong in her posture. She wasn't broken, not completely. He saddled the horse while she gathered her blanket. The fire had burned down to ash. They ate what little was left, half a biscuit, a strip of jerky. She didn't say a word, and neither did he. Out here, words didn't mean much anyway. By midday, they were riding through open country again. The land stretched wide and lonely, dotted with sagebrush and dry grass that shimmered in the heat. The cowboy's ranch wasn't far now, maybe half a day's ride. He'd built it himself years ago after leaving the army, hoping to start over away from the noise of the towns and the bloodshed of the frontier. But the past had a way of following a man, even across the desert. He glanced back at the woman from time to time. She rode behind him, silent, steady, her eyes fixed on the horizon. He could feel her watching everything, the hawks overhead, the tracks in the dirt, the faint trails of smoke that curled up from faraway hills. She was alert in a way he wasn't. She knew the land differently, like she could hear things he couldn't. After a long stretch of silence, he spoke. "You said they'd come. Who's after you?" She hesitated before answering, her voice quiet but certain. "Men with blue coats first, then men with no coats. Both take, both kill." He frowned slightly, understanding enough to know she meant soldiers and bounty hunters. He'd seen it before, raids gone wrong, camps burned, people scattered like dust. The army called it victory. Folks in towns called it progress. But for the ones caught in the middle, it was just loss. Why would they come for you? He asked. Her gaze stayed forward. Because I lived. The simplicity of her words hit harder than any long story could have. He didn't ask more. Some truths didn't need explaining. By late afternoon, the sky darkened with clouds rolling in from the west. A storm was building. He urged the horse faster, wanting to reach shelter before it broke. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and soon fat drops of rain began to fall, turning the dirt trail into sticky mud. When they reached the edge of his land, the rain came hard. His cabin sat on a rise overlooking the valley, a single structure with a small barn and corral beside it. Smoke still clung to the old chimney from the fire he'd left before heading to town. It wasn't much, but it was home. He helped her down from the horse, guiding her toward the porch as lightning split the sky. Inside, the air smelled of wood smoke and leather. She stood just inside the doorway, dripping wet, eyes scanning every corner of the room as if memorizing it. He hung his hat, stoked the fire, and handed her a dry blanket. "There's stew on the stove," he said quietly. "Ain't fancy, but it'll fill you." She hesitated, watching him with suspicion at first, then moved toward the pot. The smell of beans and beef filled the small cabin. She took a bowl and sat by the fire, eating slowly. He didn't pry or stare. He simply poured himself coffee and sat across from her, the rain beating steady against the windows. For a long while, the only sound was the storm outside. Then she spoke, her voice soft but sure. "Why did you buy me?" He looked up from his cup, unsure how to answer. "Didn't feel right leaving you there." Her eyes narrowed. "You could have walked away." He nodded. "Could have. But I didn't." She studied him for a long moment before turning back to the fire. "Men don't do something for nothing." He didn't argue. He couldn't. Out here, most men didn't. But he wasn't most men. When the rain eased, the sound of horses echoed faintly from far beyond the ridge. Both of them heard it. He went to the window, peering into the gray light. There, small figures moving slow through the wet brush. 3, maybe 4 riders. Too far to make out their faces, but close enough to know they were tracking something. The woman had risen to her feet, clutching the blanket around her shoulders. "They're here," she whispered. He turned to her, his jaw tightening. "How do you know?" "I know the sound," she said simply. "They don't ride like cowboys. They hunt." He grabbed his rifle from above the door and checked the chamber. "Then we'll make sure they don't find what they're looking for." She didn't move, just watched him. There was no fear in her eyes, only quiet readiness. He realized she'd probably been running her whole life, and this moment wasn't new to her. It was just another fight to survive. As night fell again, he put out the lamps and kept watch from the porch. The rain had stopped, but the air was damp and heavy. In the distance, coyotes cried, and the faint echo of hooves drifted closer, then faded again. He couldn't tell if they'd moved on, or were just circling in the dark. Inside, she sat by the hearth, the firelight flickering across her face. For the first time, he noticed the faint tattoo near her wrist, simple lines and dots almost worn away. He'd seen markings like that before among tribes farther south. They weren't decoration, they were identity, a sign of belonging. When he came back in, she spoke softly. "You think they will come tonight?" "Don't know," he said. "But if they do, they'll regret it." She watched him load another round into the rifle, her expression unreadable. "You fight for me," he paused. "I reckon I do. Why?" He looked at her, the fire casting long shadows between them. "Because you deserve the chance to live free, same as anyone." Her eyes softened, but she said nothing more. The silence stretched long into the night. By dawn, the storm had passed. The land glistened under the morning sun, fresh and quiet. The riders were gone, or at least out of sight. But he knew they weren't finished. Men who hunted didn't give up easily. He went outside to check the tracks, and sure enough, he found them. Hoof prints in the soft mud leading up the trail, stopping just shy of the corral. They'd been there, watching. He felt a chill crawl up his spine. When he came back inside, she was already awake, sitting near the window. "They know where you are now," she said softly. He nodded. "Then we'll have to be ready." She looked out at the hills, her voice quiet but steady. "They will not stop until I am dead or gone." "Then they'll have to go through me first," he replied. For a moment, her eyes met his, and something unspoken passed between them. Trust, maybe, or the beginning of it. She nodded once, the smallest sign of acceptance. The day stretched on in tense quiet. He showed her how to reload a rifle, how to set snares near the creek, how to spot movement on the horizon. She learned quickly, her hands steady even when her eyes betrayed the weight of old pain. When evening came, she stood outside the cabin, staring westward toward the hills. The sun bled red across the sky, and the air smelled of dust and pine. The cowboy joined her, hat low, the silence between them deep but easy. "Do you ever think of leaving?" she asked suddenly. "Used to," he said. "But I learned the land don't let go easy. It becomes part of you," she nodded faintly. "Same with people." He looked at her, not sure what to say. The moment lingered, fragile and uncertain. Then she turned away, her eyes narrowing as she spotted something far off, a flicker of movement at the ridge. She pointed. "There." He followed her gaze, his stomach tightening. In the fading light he saw them, 3 dark riders against the setting sun, unmoving, watching. The woman's voice was low but firm. "They found us." The cowboy reached for his rifle, his jaw set. The quiet peace of the day was gone, replaced by the heavy breath of coming trouble. The wind picked up again, carrying the dry scent of the plains and the faint echo of distant thunder. The night hadn't even begun, but both of them knew it was far from over. The riders didn't move for a long time. They just sat on their horses at the ridge, dark shapes against the blood-red sky. The woman and the cowboy stood in the yard, silent, both waiting for a sign. But when the first star appeared in the twilight, the riders turned and disappeared behind the hills. That should have brought relief, but it didn't. The cowboy knew what that meant. They weren't retreating. They were planning. He didn't say anything, just guided her back inside the cabin and shut the door. The fire was still glowing low in the hearth, and its light danced against the wooden walls. She watched him as he bolted the door and checked the rifle again. He didn't need to explain what was happening. The look in his eyes said enough. "They won't attack now," she said quietly. "They wait for night. Easier to kill when it's dark." He gave a grim nod. "I figured as much." She sat down by the window, wrapping her blanket tighter. "They follow scent, not trail," she added softly. "They hunt like wolves." He frowned at that. Whoever these men were, they weren't just bounty hunters. They were trained trackers, maybe scouts who'd turned to outlaw work after the wars. The kind who didn't give up and didn't care who got in their way. As the night grew deeper, the wind rose again, carrying the faint howls of coyotes through the valley. Every sound outside seemed sharper, the groan of the cabin, the creak of the corral gate, the soft tap of rain against the roof. The woman didn't speak again, and neither did he. They just waited. Hours passed. Then came the sound he'd been dreading. The quiet, deliberate crunch of boots in the mud outside. One step, then another. He motioned for her to stay low and crept toward the door, rifle ready. Through the narrow crack beside the frame, he saw shadows moving, 2 of them this time, one circling toward the barn, the other crouching near the fence. He raised the rifle, then froze when the woman's hand touched his arm. Her eyes were wide but calm. "Wait," she whispered. "They test." He hesitated. She was right. These men weren't attacking yet. They were watching, seeing if anyone was awake, if the cabin was guarded. Minutes felt like hours as the figures moved silently through the dark. Then, as quickly as they'd come, they disappeared again into the trees. The cowboy didn't move for a long while after, his grip tight on the rifle. Finally, when the wind covered the last sound of footsteps, he exhaled slowly. "They'll come back," he said quietly. She nodded, her expression unreadable. "When the moon sleeps." He banked the fire and sat near the door, keeping watch while she tried to rest. But she didn't sleep either. Her eyes stayed open, reflecting the faint light of the dying fire. In the uneasy quiet that followed, the cowboy found himself studying her again. There was still so much he didn't know, where she came from, who she'd lost, and what made those men hunt her so relentlessly. But every instinct told him she wasn't just some runaway or captive. There was something more, something hidden behind the silence she wore like armor. The next morning, the world looked almost peaceful. The valley glowed under the pale dawn, the grass wet with dew. The riders were gone, leaving only faint hoof prints in the mud. But peace on the frontier never lasted long. He went out to tend the animals while she collected water from the creek. It was quiet work, the kind that kept a man's mind busy enough not to wander. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. When she came back from the stream, she spoke in a low voice. "They left a sign." He turned sharply. "What kind of sign?" She pointed toward a tree near the path. A feather hung there tied with a strip of leather, black, torn, and marked with ash. "What's it mean?" he asked, her gaze darkened. "It means they will come again. Soon." He took the feather down and tossed it into the fire, watching it curl into smoke. He didn't ask who they were anymore. He knew now this wasn't just about her. Whatever she carried, memory, guilt, or something worse, had drawn death to his doorstep. That day they prepared. He checked every weapon he had, 2 rifles, a revolver, an old shotgun. He made sure the horses were fed and the water barrels were full. She moved silently through the cabin, helping where she could, fixing ropes, gathering herbs, and setting traps near the edges of the yard. He noticed she handled the knife like someone who'd used one for more than cooking. By evening, the quiet between them had changed. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was something like trust, though unspoken. She would glance at him sometimes, as if trying to understand what kind of man would risk everything for a stranger. He, in turn, found himself wondering why he hadn't turned her away when he had the chance. That night, after they finished a simple supper, she finally spoke about what happened. "My people camped near the river," she said softly, staring into the flames. "We were few, children, women, the old ones. Soldiers came first, said they wanted peace. But peace dies when greed is born. They took food, horses, and the land. When we refused, they burned everything." He didn't interrupt. "After the fire, the men with no coats came," she continued. "They were not soldiers. They were worse. They hunted us, sold us. I ran for many days, but they found me again near the canyon." Her voice faltered and she fell silent. The cowboy looked away, his jaw tight. He'd seen that story before. Different faces, same cruelty. The West had a way of swallowing people whole and pretending it was progress. "So that's who's after you," he said finally. "The same men who took you before." She nodded. "They never leave what they claim." He understood then that she wasn't just a fugitive. She was a symbol of defiance, a living reminder of what those men had done. As long as she was alive, their crime had a witness. Before either of them could say more, the horses in the corral began to stir, ears twitching, nostrils flaring. The cowboy rose instantly, grabbing his rifle. "They're close," she whispered. He motioned for her to stay low and crept to the window. Through the darkness, he saw faint movement near the barn. 3 figures this time, moving slow, cautious. The moon hung behind a thin veil of clouds, casting a silver glow across the land. He steadied his rifle, but the woman touched his shoulder. "Not yet," she murmured. "They want you to fire first." He hesitated, realizing she was right again. If he shot now, they'd know where he was, and he only had a few rounds to spare. The men moved closer, one pausing near the fence. Then, in the quiet, one of them spoke, his voice deep and mocking. "Cowboy, you got something that belongs to us." The cowboy stayed still, his heart thudding. "We ain't here to kill you long as you hand her over," the voice called again. "Ain't no sense dying for a filthy runaway." The woman's hands clenched around the blanket. She didn't speak, didn't move. The cowboy finally called back, his tone steady. "She's under my protection. You want her, you'll have to come take her." Silence followed, broken only by the rustle of wind through the grass. Then a laugh echoed in the dark, low, cold, and certain. "Suit yourself, cowboy," the man said. "We'll be seeing you soon." The sound of hooves faded into the night. He lowered the rifle slowly, feeling the weight of what had just been promised. She met his eyes. "They won't leave now." "I know," he said quietly. "Which means we fight." Over the next few days, the ranch became a fortress. He reinforced the doors, gathered what ammunition he could find, and moved supplies into the cellar. She helped without complaint, her movements efficient, deliberate. Between them, something wordless grew, a bond shaped by danger and the shared will to survive. But the unease never left. Each night they heard sounds, distant whistles, the crack of twigs, the echo of riders passing in the dark. The enemy was close, circling, waiting for the perfect moment. On the 4th night, smoke rose from the eastern ridge. It wasn't from campfires, it was signal smoke. "They call others," she said, her face pale in the firelight. "Not just men. The ones they pay, bounty hunters?" he asked. She nodded. "They will come from every direction." He stared into the dark beyond the window, a heavy silence filling the room. He'd been outnumbered before, but this time, he wasn't fighting for himself. When the first gunshot cracked across the valley, it wasn't a warning. It was the beginning. The bullet struck the porch beam, splintering wood. The horses screamed. He shoved her down behind the table and returned fire, the flash lighting up the yard for a heartbeat. Then another shot came, and another. They were surrounded. The fight had found them at last. And dawn was still hours away. The gunfire came in waves, sharp and cracking through the still night air. Each shot echoed off the canyon walls, bouncing through the valley like thunder. The cowboy crouched behind the overturned table, his rifle pressed tight against his shoulder. The woman huddled beside him, her face pale but steady. Every time the bullets hit the cabin walls, dust fell from the beams above them, and the smell of gunpowder thickened in the air. He fired back twice, the flash from his rifle lighting up the room. He didn't aim to kill, just to keep them from getting closer. But there were too many shadows moving out there, and each one seemed to know exactly where to hide. "Stay low," he muttered. She nodded, gripping the knife she'd carried since the night he found her. Her knuckles were white, but her eyes were calm, almost too calm. She had seen this before. Ambushes, attacks, the cruelty of men who hunted others for money or power. A bullet tore through the window, shattering glass across the floor. The cowboy ducked, pulling her closer to the ground. The fire had died down to embers, leaving the cabin half dark. He could hear them now, boots crunching through the wet earth, low voices giving orders. "They're closing in," he whispered. She reached for the rifle beside him. "Give it to me," he hesitated. "You know how to shoot?" She gave him a hard look that didn't need words. He handed it over, and she moved to the other window, quiet as a shadow. When the next figure darted past the barn, she squeezed the trigger. The rifle kicked hard, the shot clean and true. A cry split the night, followed by angry shouts. "Good shot," he murmured. She didn't answer, just reloaded quickly, her face set with cold focus. The cowboy crawled to the back wall, checking the small trap door that led beneath the cabin. He'd built it years ago as a storm shelter, but tonight it might be their only escape. He didn't want to use it yet, not unless they had to. Then came the sound of something heavy hitting the door. Once. Twice. Someone was trying to break it down. He raised the shotgun, aimed and fired through the wood. The blast shook the walls. Silence followed, except for the faint sound of someone groaning outside. The woman glanced toward him, breathing hard. "How many?" "Too many," he said quietly. "4, maybe more." "They don't stop till morning," she replied. He knew she was right. Men like that didn't quit once they'd cornered their prey. They'd wait for daylight if they had to, make sure their targets couldn't slip away. Hours crawled by. The shooting slowed, then stopped altogether. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. It meant they were regrouping, or planning something worse. The cowboy checked the ammunition. 2 rounds left for the rifle, 3 for the revolver, not enough to hold out another attack. He met her eyes. "If they rush us again, we run for the horses." She shook her head. "They'll expect that." "Maybe. But staying here ain't much better." For the first time, he saw fear flicker behind her calm. "If they take me alive," she said softly, "they'll make you watch." He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The look in his eyes said he'd die before letting that happen. Just before dawn, the air grew heavy and cold. Mist rolled down from the hills, covering the valley in a thin veil of gray. The cowboy peered through the cracked window and caught sight of movement, a flicker near the barn, then another near the fence line. They were closing in again, using the fog for cover. He raised his rifle, but before he could fire, something unexpected happened. A sharp whistle echoed across the field. It was the kind used by scouts to signal position. The woman froze. "That sound," she whispered. He looked at her. "What is it?" She didn't answer right away, her brow furrowing in confusion. "That's not theirs." A second whistle came, this time from the opposite ridge. Then another from behind the barn. Whoever was out there, it wasn't just the same hunters from before. There were more now, different ones. The cowboy's gut tightened. "Looks like the word spread," he said grimly. "You weren't wrong about more coming." "They fight each other," she murmured suddenly. "Different groups. They want the same prize." He turned toward her, realization dawning. "You mean you?" She nodded. "One sells to soldiers, the other keeps for ransom. I am worth more alive than dead." He felt his chest tighten at the thought. It wasn't just greed driving them, it was power. Whoever controlled her story controlled something bigger, maybe proof of what had been done to her people, maybe something even darker. Outside, shouting broke through the mist. Gunfire erupted again, but this time it wasn't aimed at the cabin. The men were shooting at each other. The cowboy moved to the door, careful not to expose himself. Through the fog, he could see flashes of light and figures ducking behind trees. The air filled with smoke and chaos. "This might be our chance," he whispered. She nodded. "Go!" He grabbed his hat, slung the rifle across his back, and opened the door just enough for them to slip out. The morning air was cold and sharp, carrying the smell of gunpowder and wet earth. They moved fast, crouching low as they crossed the yard. The horses were in the corral, spooked but alive. He was just about to open the gate when a shot rang out. The bullet hit the post inches from his hand. "Down!" he shouted. They dropped behind the trough as another shot tore through the mist. The woman peeked over the edge, spotting a lone figure near the barn. Without hesitating, she raised the rifle and fired. The man fell. The cowboy caught her arm. "We've got to move." They mounted quickly, the horses' hooves sinking deep in the wet dirt. The fog was thick now, hiding their path as they galloped toward the ridge. But behind them, voices rose again, angry, desperate. The hunters had noticed their escape. Bullets whistled past as they rode hard through the trees. Branches slapped at their faces, and the sound of hooves thundered behind them. The cowboy urged the horse faster, feeling the animal's muscles strain beneath him. The woman clung tight, her breath coming in short gasps. When they reached the creek, he steered the horse into the water, following the current downstream. The sound would mask their trail. For a few minutes it worked. The gunfire faded, replaced by the rush of water and the pounding of his heartbeat. But then came the sound of dogs, barking, snarling, closing in fast. She looked back, her eyes wide. They brought hounds. He cursed under his breath. "We'll head for the canyon. They can't follow far in there." The canyon walls rose high ahead, jagged and narrow. They rode into its shadows just as the sun began to rise, streaking the sky in gold and crimson. The air grew cooler, echoing with their horses' labored breaths. Behind them, the barking grew faint but didn't stop. The cowboy slowed the horse near a cluster of rocks, helping her down. "We'll rest here a minute." She nodded, leaning against the canyon wall, catching her breath. Her face was streaked with dirt, her eyes tired but determined. "They won't stop," she said softly. "Not till one of us is gone." He looked at her for a long moment. "Then we make sure it ain't us." From somewhere above, a rock shifted and tumbled down the slope. They both froze. Then came another. Someone was up there. The cowboy raised his revolver, scanning the ridge. The light was too bright now, blinding him as the sun climbed higher. Then he saw them, 3 figures moving along the rim, rifles slung over their shoulders, eyes fixed on the canyon below. He grabbed her hand. "We've got to move." They ran deeper into the canyon, the sound of pursuit echoing off the stone walls. Each step kicked up dust, each breath burned. The narrow passage twisted and turned, the sunlight fading to shadow. At one bend, they found an opening in the rock, a narrow gap that led into a dark hollow. The cowboy pulled her inside, pressing a finger to his lips. Outside, the footsteps grew louder. Voices called out, searching, echoing. "They went this way." One shouted. The cowboy held his breath, his hand resting on the revolver. He could feel her trembling beside him, though her face stayed steady. The shadows outside moved closer, their outlines stretching across the canyon wall. The men were near, so close he could hear the scrape of their boots on stone, the rasp of their breath. One of them stopped right outside the hollow, his silhouette framed by the light. He turned his head slightly, listening. The cowboy's pulse hammered in his ears. His finger hovered near the trigger. One wrong move, one sound, and it would all be over. The man stepped forward, peering into the darkness where they hid, and in that split second, everything hung by a thread. The man stood at the mouth of the hollow, his shadow stretching long across the dusty ground. The cowboy didn't move, barely breathed, every muscle tight as a coiled spring. The woman stood behind him, her back pressed against the cool stone, her heartbeat steady against his shoulder. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. The only sound was the whisper of wind weaving through the canyon. Then a shout came from somewhere farther down the ridge. The man at the entrance turned his head toward it, hesitated, and then moved on, his footsteps fading into the distance. The cowboy exhaled slowly, lowering the revolver. His hand trembled, not from fear, but from exhaustion. The woman reached out, touched his arm gently, and whispered, "It's over. For now." He nodded, eyes still on the canyon wall where the shadow had just disappeared. "For now," he said quietly, though deep down he wasn't sure if he believed it. They waited a few more minutes before stepping out into the sunlight again. The air outside was warm, golden light spilling across the stone. The storm of gunfire, smoke, and chase that had carried them through the night now felt far away, like something from another lifetime. Their horses had vanished, likely spooked off into the valley, but they were alive. That was enough. They began walking through the canyon, slow and careful. The ground was rough, covered in loose rocks and dust. The cowboy kept scanning the ridges, but the men were gone. The silence now felt like a gift. By noon, they reached the far end of the canyon where it opened into a small plain. A narrow stream cut through the earth there, and they followed it until they found a shaded spot beneath a cluster of mesquite trees. The woman knelt beside the water, washing the dirt and blood from her hands. The cowboy filled his hat, poured water over his face, and let the coolness sink into his skin. After a while, he sat down beside her. "You got a name?" he asked softly. She looked at him, her eyes thoughtful. "Tayen," she said finally. "It means new moon." He nodded slowly. "Fitting. You came out of the dark." A small smile touched her lips. "And you? What do they call you?" He hesitated. "Jack. Just Jack." She nodded, and they sat in silence for a while, listening to the sound of the stream. Jack thought about everything that had happened. The ambush, the men who hunted them, the fire that nearly swallowed them whole. He knew they wouldn't stop searching. Men like that never did. But he also knew they'd hurt each other enough in that canyon to buy them time. Maybe a few days, maybe a week. Time was all they needed to figure out the next step. As the sun dipped low in the sky, they built a small fire with dry twigs. Jack cooked what little they had. Jerky, a bit of cornmeal he'd carried in his saddlebag. Tayen watched the flames, her face calm but distant. After a while, she spoke. "You didn't have to help me." Jack stirred the fire with a stick. "Didn't feel right to walk away." She turned toward him. "You lost something because of me." He shook his head. "No, I lost things long before you showed up. You just gave me a reason to care again." For the first time since he'd met her, she looked at him with warmth. It wasn't gratitude, not exactly, more like understanding. They were two people from different worlds, but both had been chased, hunted, and broken in their own ways. Out here, survival had made them equals. That night, the stars stretched endless above them. The wind had softened, carrying the scent of wild sage and dust. Tayen lay near the fire, her eyes tracing the constellations. Jack sat with his back against a rock, the revolver in his lap, listening to the night sounds. He could still hear the faint echo of the past, the gunfire, the shouting, but it grew quieter with each hour that passed. By morning, they were ready to move. The world felt new again, washed clean by the rising sun. They followed the stream eastward until they reached a small ridge that overlooked the valley. From there, Jack could see smoke rising far in the distance, maybe from a camp or a burned-out settlement. He knew what it meant. The men hadn't given up. He looked over at Tayen. "If we keep heading east, we'll reach Carson's Crossing in 2 days. It's not much, but there's shelter, food, and folks who don't ask questions." She adjusted the strap on her small satchel and nodded. "And after that?" He looked out toward the horizon. "After that, we figure it out. The journey was hard." The land grew harsher as they traveled. Rocky ridges, dry gullies, long stretches of dust where the wind carried the sound of coyotes. They spoke little, saving their energy for walking. Still, something unspoken grew between them. Trust. At dusk on the second day, they finally saw the faint outline of Carson's Crossing, a small cluster of buildings surrounded by fences and open fields. Smoke rose from chimneys, and the sound of a distant piano carried on the breeze. It felt almost unreal after so many days of running. They reached town just as night fell. Jack led the way to an old boarding house on the edge of town, its sign faded and hanging crooked. The woman who owned it recognized him right away. "Jack Rivers," she said, squinting through her spectacles. "Ain't seen you since you sold that mare of yours." Jack smiled faintly. "Been on the road a while, Miss Edna. Just need a couple nights in a quiet corner." She glanced at Tayen, suspicion flickering in her eyes for a moment, but she said nothing more. She gave them a room and a warm meal. Later that night, after Edna had gone to bed, Jack sat by the window looking out at the quiet street. Tayen joined him, her hair unbound now, falling loose over her shoulders. "You think we're safe here?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. "Safe enough for tonight," she nodded. "That's all any of us can ask." He turned to her. "What will you do when it's over?" When they stopped looking, she looked out the window at the stars. "Go home," she said softly. "If there's anything left to go back to." Jack leaned back, the weight of her words sitting heavy in his chest. He knew what she meant. For people like her, home wasn't just a place. It was a memory of something the world had taken. Before dawn, he woke to the sound of footsteps outside. Not heavy, not hurried, just careful. He reached for his revolver, eyes sharp. But it wasn't danger this time. It was Edna's old hound wandering by the porch. He let out a breath, smiled faintly, and sat back down. When the morning came, they packed their things quietly. Tyann tied her hair back, slipped the knife into her belt, and looked at him. "You're not staying here, are you?" He shook his head. "Never been much good at sitting still. Where will you go?" "South, maybe. Find work. Stay ahead of the dust." She studied him for a long moment. "Then I'll go north, toward the river, if you ever find yourself there." He nodded, understanding without words. Outside, the sun rose bright and full, painting the town in soft light. He helped her mount one of the borrowed horses, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. The air was cool, filled with the quiet hum of a town waking up. "Thank you, Jack," she said finally. He tipped his hat. "Take care of yourself, Tyann." She smiled, then turned her horse toward the road and began to ride. He watched until she disappeared over the hill, the dust rising behind her like a ghost of all they'd survived. Jack stood there a while longer, the wind tugging at his coat, the past fading like smoke on the breeze. He didn't know what the future held, maybe peace, maybe another fight. But as he looked out at the endless horizon, he felt something he hadn't in a long time, hope, and in that quiet golden light, with the world still turning and the scars of the past slowly healing, the cowboy turned his horse west and rode on. Just a man, a story, and the open land that had taught him what it meant to keep going, no matter the odds.